plane that he was flying the whole time is a consolidated C-87 and basically, or Liberator, and basically it's a converted B-24. B-24 is the bomber, the C-87 is the cargo plane. So it's I don't know how well you can see this, it's just a rendering of the inside of that plane. It's a huge plane. One of the members came up and talked to me earlier about how it was a plane that you really had to muscle. It was not an easy plane to fly. So on this day, they took off from their base in Jorhat, India, en route to Kunming, China. And as far as we can tell, again, these numbers could be slightly off, but he was loaded down with small arms ammunition, 4,500 gallons of gasoline, and I put 10 1,000 bombs because I've seen anywhere from 10 to 18. But either way, he was flying a giant stick of dynamite. Because of, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So on these planes, there was a crew of 4. So my grandfather, Captain James T. Cunningham, was the pilot. The co-pilot was Lieutenant Robert D. Campbell, who was a friend of his, high school friend of his, in Pensacola. There was a flight engineer, Sergeant Paul J. Bucamp, and a radio operator, Sergeant William Gunn. Bucamp was from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and William Gunn was from St. Louis. A lot of the reason we know this story is my father and I met Sergeant Bucamp in 1985. My dad looked him up. We went and visited him when we were there visiting my grandparents, my other grandparents on the other side. And when it was 1985, so I was 14. I remember it. I don't remember all the details, but this is where my dad got the details of the story. So they took off, and I'm going to talk about the weather, trying to get airborne, the control issues they had, and one of the flight crew passing out. So the conditions were that the top of the clouds were about 23,000 feet in the air, and there was reports that they should expect icing and a lot of turbulence. So Sergeant Bucamp said that none of them were really worried, right? They had all flown together. The 3 of them, Bucamp, Campbell, and Cunningham, had flown together multiple times, and in fact, Bucamp wasn't even scheduled to fly that day, but because his 2 buddies were flying, he decided I'll tag along and fly this time. Sergeant Gunn, it wasn't his first flight, but it was the first time he had flown with the 3 of them. Again, they weren't that concerned, but then at the same time, they also were talking about we might have to parachute out because we're carrying such a heavy load. So that was the discussion as they're about to take off. They struggled to get airborne, fought the plane, got it up to about 22,000 feet, and my grandfather, JT, indicated that he was having trouble with the controls, the trim tabs, and the autopilot weren't functioning properly. So Bucamp, who was the engineer, went back to go check on the problem and see if he could fix it. And at that time, he walked past Sergeant Gunn, who was passed out in his chair. And he looked at him, and basically the reason he passed out is he had rolled his chair on top of his oxygen hose and cut it off. So before he went and fixed the plane, he woke up Sergeant Gunn. So the next events happened pretty rapidly. The plane started icing up, and my grandfather reported that the engine number 1 basically had seized up and wasn't functioning. He, at that point, ordered them to prepare to bail out, but not to bail out yet. they managed to reach 27,000 feet, so at this point they're above the clouds. And then in pretty rapid succession, engine number 3 sustained a power loss, so he's down to 2 engines, and then shortly after that, engine number 4 exploded and caught fire. And Bucamp said when that explosion happened, he thought the wing had been blown off the plane because it rocked it so bad. And at that point, my grandfather gave them the order to bail out. So in the events of everything going wrong that can go wrong, Bucamp and Sergeant Gunn went back to the back hatch. They went back to the left rear hatch and tried to open it. And when they tried to open it, the pins on the hatch broke and they couldn't open the door. So they then turned to the right hatch and tried to open that one, and it opens. Right as he opened the door, basically the plane went into a steep turn. He had told us that the last time he saw my grandfather and Lieutenant Campbell, they were both struggling to keep the plane level. And so he gets the hatch open, Sergeant Gunn's with him at that point, but when the plane took the dive, basically, he didn't see Gunn again. So he managed to hang onto the side of the fuselage, climb a few feet up to the actual hatch, and parachute out. So as he's parachuting, basically all he saw was the smoke. He didn't see a crash, he didn't see an explosion. Again, you're in the Himalayan mountains. I'm not exactly sure what his view was, but all he saw was the smoke coming from the wreckage. He landed on the side of a mountain, basically, and said that the only thing that kept him from falling off a 500-foot cliff after he landed is his parachute actually snagged on a tree branch, a lower tree branch. And so he managed to get up, wrap up his parachute, and start hiking down the mountain, which took him basically half of the day to get to the base of the mountain. At this point, he didn't know if anybody else made it out. So as he got to the bottom of the mountain, he reached a small stream, and on the other side of the stream there was a Chinese native with a crossbow who they startled each other, and he said the Chinese native waved him across to come across the river, and he said as he was walking across this river, in his words, and this is a quote, he proceeded to fall on his ass in the cold mountain water and soak himself to the bone. So at that point, he said the Chinese native ran off, was gone for a few minutes, and then came back with several other people. They led him to, I'm probably going to butcher this name, but they led him to a little village in Zhongpai, and it's approximately 12 miles west of where the crash occurred. He ended up sleeping that night, rolled up in his parachute, and said he had his .45 in his hand the whole night. And then the folks that were in that village, there's a whole nother story, and there's actually a book, not a very widespread book, but about there was a Pentecostal missionary in the area named Mr. Fisher who was there for missionary work, and part of the things that he did was help down airmen get back to their base, give them supplies, give them some folks to help them get back, and all in all, during that time, it's reported that he helped 17 airmen get back to their base. So to continue Paul's bad day and bad month, he then said that he walked for approximately 38 days and ended up back at the Burma Road, ran into, which ran into the British Army at the Burma Road, and he was eventually transported back to his unit, and he ended up, I'm not sure which flight number 71 was for him, but he ended up flying several more missions and ended up ending the war with 80 total missions. So this is where the letters get desperate. You start reading we have some of the letters that my grandmother wrote, because a lot of them got returned. The letters from him stopped, which is not a normal thing. They weren't necessarily coming every day, but she would get 3, 4, 5 letters at once, or 10 letters at once, and it would be the last 10 days. But those stopped, and the documents and the letters that we have indicate a lot of speculation and hope that he's still alive, because at first it was just reported that he was missing. It finally came through that he was killed in the flight, and at that point there's a lot of back and forth and some official letters from the Army. Basically, she spent several years trying to get his remains back to North Carolina, where she lived. She lived in a small town called Newton, North Carolina, which is about as big as those 2 tables over there. That's where my dad was born. So there was between her and JT's mother, they spent a lot of time writing letters trying to get his remains back to North Carolina. So initially, they did recover some of the remains, and they were interned at the U.S. military cemetery in Kunming, China. And because they weren't able to distinguish all of the who was who, he's actually buried with William Gunn in Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. And the reason they did Louisville, Kentucky is it's not exactly, but they said it was halfway between JT's home and halfway between Sergeant Gunn's home in St. Louis. So the story gets, this is the small world part of the story. So my dad retired 20 years ago, I guess. And one of the first things he did is he became a volunteer for the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg. And he does oral histories. And so basically he finds veterans and then interviews them, records it, and uploads it to the archives in the museum.